In the history of political philosophy, no ideology has been as misunderstood, libelled and fabricated as much as fascism. For Marxists of the early 20th century, from Julius Braunfeld to Arpam Dutt, attempted to claim that it was the product of late-stage capitalism, where in its dying breath following the First World War, capitalists on the Italian peninsula afforded power to the violent and reactionary opponents of the Third International to maintain for a little longer their own power. A baseless theory that was soon dropped upon further analysis in the ensuing decades, but then ignorantly rediscovered by today's progressive left. Fascism is regarded as the epitome of white supremacist racism and anti-Semitism in modern culture. Anyone or anything remotely displaying perceived discriminatory and authoritarian views, be it a president the media didn't plan for or the police system, is adjectively associated with the horrors of the Holocaust, which near single-handedly reinforces the moral opposition to the accused intellectually underdeveloped psychological phenomenon that was the fascist movement in the eyes of the likes of Wilhelm Reich. It should come as no surprise then that such an abused part of philosophic history is in actuality considerably more intelligent than it is presented by the victors of history. In two of A. James Gregor's most well-known books, Mussolini's Intellectuals and The Faces of Janus, the development of fascism and its Marxist critiques are mapped chronologically, showing a clear rationale for how fascism came to exist in the minds of its advocates and opposition respectively. What many might not realise, however, is that the relationship between the two movements of Marxist communism, later Russian Bolshevism, and Italian fascism are considerably more entwined than one would expect. All it takes to realise this is to see the natural development of fascism as an ideology and communism as a political movement. In this essay I will explain and elaborate upon this reality, drawing from the works of Gregor among other fascist and Marxist intellectuals. To understand the similarities between these two world-changing 20th century movements is, as I will highlight, a crucial means to understand the state of politics today. Through Karl Marx's life, he detailed extensively the scientific and rational unfolding of history from one economic phase to the next, as products of material development as opposed to any prior described sentiment of idealism. For the syndicalist Georges Sorel, however, it was not enough to proclaim logical inevitability for your revolution by observation of economic stages, and so he tasked himself with understanding what motivated someone to risk dying for a cause they'll never see the ends of. In response to that imperative, Sorel isolated those elements in human behaviour that appeared to sustain and inform individual and collective heroism, sacrifice and commitment. He identified those elements with what he chose to call myths, figures of speech that, within themselves, captured the essence of an imaginary future sought with an irrepressible passion. Such evocative images of an anticipated future overcome the sterilities of intellectualism, born of an absence of passion and lack of vitality. They created the ideal tension that inspires the individual and, in the group, the readiness to sacrifice in heroic selflessness in the service of a higher good. Sorel, as a syndicalist, believed in an organic approach to workers' organisations detached from party socialism. He believed that revolution would not occur as a mere logical inevitability of the progression of history, but rather had to be sought after via the destruction of the enemies of the revolutionary proletariat. In his context being a workers' strike against the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois state, of which he lamented for its false promises of mediation resulting in only violence against the lower classes. Out of the crucible of class combat would then emerge the sublimely heroic worker, warrior and producer of the anticipated syndicalist future. During the early years of the 20th century, however, new approaches needed to be taken to adapt and develop the meaning of these ideas. Chief among the intellectuals who embodied this change in Italy was Sergio Panunzio. As early as 1907, Panunzio opted out of a purely class-based dialectic of history pushed by his fellow Marxists, preferring the notion put forth by Ludwig Gumplerich that history was less precisely determined by the interaction between groups, be they tribes, ethnicities, nations, classes, each configured by group-building influences such as kinship, mutual interest, common territory, or collective purpose. And so in Panunzio's Socialismo, Syndicalismo, El Sociologia, he argues that in the modern era, class so happens to be the dominant driving force of history, as well as that these groups achieve self-conscience through their cooperation, competition, and conflict. Panunzio, in acquiring his degree in jurisprudence in 1908, dedicated much of his time to the philosophy and theory of law and its relationship with economics and society, as detailed in his La Persistenza del Diritto, in which he argues that law will always exist in society as an extension of organising communities. This work marked a notable departure in his thinking from the traditionally anarchistic tendencies of old syndicalism. While syndicalism in Sorel's understanding oppose authority and law as extensions of the state, Panunzio described the manifestation of law and authority to be contingent on the social life of its adherents. Obedience to law, he argued, was not simply or characteristically coerced. It arises out of the very circumstances of social life. The authority that sustains law, Panunzio proceeded, is not external to the willed behaviours of individuals, but is intrinsic to them and the human condition. The modern class-based state, in his eyes, was sustained by a rigid artificial authority in effort to hold together opposing interests, identifying issues with its artificiality over the authority or classes themselves. What was therefore needed to return society to an organic structure was a revolution against the system and the construction of organic groups in the forms of syndicates. Syndicates were voluntary and held homogeneous interests, and as the old parliamentary system disintegrated, hopefully finished by a general strike, organic syndicates with juridical power independent of the state would unify into their own singular and superior organic authority, thereby replacing the state with its own law and authority without the application of violence. Out of this is evidence of the formulation of an organic corporate state embodying the general will of all in its authority. In the years of the Great War, Panunzio had also become disinterested in the internationalism pushed by socialists as the myth to drive his revolution. In his article Il Socialismo e la Guerra, featured in Benito Mussolini's Utopia journal, Panunzio noted that the war had united nations each into their integral unities. The unmatched organic patriotism spurred on by the war had made for a far stronger national myth than any sentiment of class combat. This would go on to inspire him to establish a wholly national myth for his syndicalist movement, seeing Italians entering into the war as a means to create the warrior producers anticipated by the likes of Sorel. The war proved beyond question, in his judgment, that an Italian worker and an Italian entrepreneur shared a greater sense of affinity than was possible between an Italian worker and a German worker. Shared territory and a shared history, in which entire nations, animated by a common culture and common aspirations, reacted to the offences, the exactions and pretences of others, made nationality an active principle in modern history. It was clear that what Panunzio was working towards as an individual was the realisation of the merging of his authoritative syndicalism with the myth of a nation to form a sort of national syndicalism. However, Panunzio was not alone in this realisation, nor was he the first to make appeals from one side of politics to the other to form a sense of national syndicalism. Following the Risorgimento era of Italian unification, it was clear that if Italy was to maintain its newfound state, it was to embark on high degrees of economic development, not only to sustain itself, but to eventually compete with the then superpowers of the United Kingdom and France. As the nationalist Giovanni Papini detailed in 1904, Italy had three separate stages of its nationalism. The first, conceived of by the likes of Dante and Leopardi, were purely poetic, followed by a philosophical nationalism propagated by the likes of Gioberti and Mazzini, which led into the third, beginning at the turn of the century, which was centred around economics. Over a decade prior to the syndicalist discovery of a nation forming a stronger myth than class, the nationalists were fully aware that without its antithesis, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie are ultimately meaningless, and found reciprocal balance within the singular entity of the nation. Being the economically retrograded country that Italy was in its early steps as a unified nation, it was clear to nationalists in this time that the international projects of Italian Marxists, pitting the perceived proletariat against the perceived bourgeoisie, was at minimum an immaturely thought out project, and at maximum fundamentally flawed in its understandings of world history. A mistake carried on far into the future decades to be redirected back at Italy in the era of fascism. Nevertheless, it was important to address the growing tide of communist sentiment in Italy as a part of Europe for nationalists who sought to keep the country from falling into any worse financial decay than it was already in. In 1909, in Syndicalismo, Nazionalismo, Imperialismo by Enrico Corradini, he outlined one of the first mergings of revolutionary syndicalism and nationalism, which would begin a continual appeal to syndicalist intellectuals at the time to see the merit of nationalism. Corradini addressed many Marxist theories as a byproduct of contemporary scientism, that all issues could be solved rationally without the need for philosophical inquiry. Corradini's sentiment, shared by the syndicalists of his time, was that it would be an error to view non-rationalistic tendencies as defunct products of any given point in history. Rather, those myths and ideals and morals to which we strive for are, for the large part, the material we use to fight for a better world, the critical, motivating elements of any form of political change. Syndicalists and nationalists in this time were also beginning to share other similarities that would put them on the path to unification by the end of the 1910s. Both took an interest in the role of group psychology where the Marxists hadn't. The syndicalist thought leaders Eo Olivetti and Paolo Orano both published works analysing the role of a crowd and its leaders, and in a similar period Scipio Sighelli, a nationalist intellectual, was developing his own works in that area. Both syndicalists and nationalists recognised that collective psychology informed political behaviour. Both sought to understand the processes involved. Traditional Marxism had not provided an account of how revolutions proceeded, how masses were moved to revolutionary enterprise. Marxism had not spoken of the role of leaders in the mobilization of the masses. It did not address itself to the role of great men, the heroes of history, and what factors entered into their program of historic change. By 1910, Corradini, next to Olivetti once again, criticised the parliamentary system for its representation of parochial interests over the general will, and for its short-term compromises would never see Italy become a great nation to compete with the rest of the world. As well as this, Corradini criticised the syndicalist view of a union of labourers as the collective whole necessary for their syndicalist society, in regarding the working population as one half of an organic national whole which would be unstable and unprosperous in the modern world. In Corradini's eyes, syndicalism could only find validation through a type of national syndicalism. By the beginning of the 1910s, it was clear that nationalist and syndicalist circles had much in common. They both recognised the ineptitude of Marxist socialism, that myths were the true driving forces of revolutionary politics over the cold logic of the economic development of history. They recognised that group psychology was driven by a minority of intellectual leaders who were to be the ones who would ensure the future development of Italy. They held a common disdain for parliamentary compromise and soon came to respect each other's merits, for syndicalists the myth of the great nation, and for nationalists the promise of organic economic development. In this time, Corradini laid the foundations for the notion of a proletarian nation, a concept broadly still used today by the New Left under the name dependency theory. Italy, as a late-coming economy, was thrust into the global market dominated by the pioneering and developed plutocratic nations of the United Kingdom and France. As a result, it had seen the peninsula plundered of its resources and population as they emigrated to France and the Americas in search of work. Because the industrial infrastructure of the global market was highly monopolized among a select few powerful nation-states, it was to be expected that those late-coming proletarian economies would be faced with near-perpetual dependency on plutocratic ones. For Corradini, the development of Italian industry into a self-sufficient economy was vital for its insulation against the plutocracies of Europe. As a result, the Associazione Nazionalista Italiana was established in an effort to unify the classes of Italy towards a common goal, imagining a corporativist Italy to replace the current establishment. In 1911, the nationalist sentiment stirred in the wake of Italy's war against Turkey, then brought the myth of a nation to the front of socialist, anti-nationalist and syndicalist politics, resulting in Olivetti to refer to similar notions of a proletarian Italian nation waging war on plutocratic ones. He also acknowledged nationalism, like syndicalism, to be one of the few other respectable revolutionary movements, commending its like-minded communitarian characteristics and aversion to the conservatism rampant in then socialism and parliamentary democracy. Italian nationalism, near indistinguishable from the later fascist movement, had evolved to incorporate traditionally leftist characteristics into its thought. Italian economic nationalism saw the organic whole of a nation as proletarianized in the face of a global market, dominated by plutocratic bourgeois nations of the United Kingdom and France. It was evident that in order to counter the plundering of the country by these powers, as Italy depended on them for industry, Italy had to find economic, social and political self-sufficiency from the wider capitalistic, parliamentarian, liberal machine running the world economy in the early 1900s. By combining Sorelian syndicalist ideas with the ideal of the national community, they synthesized a corporativist, patriotic ideology prepared to be analysed by new intellectuals such as Giovanni Gentile, Alfredo Rocco and Benito Mussolini as the nationalism of the 1990s and 1910s transitioned into the more politically manifested movement we know today. This, combined with the research of Sergio Panunzio into law, authority and organic political structures, would make for a far more intellectually developed ideology than what the Marxists, then and now, would see it for. Not long after the March on Rome, Marxists eagerly began to respond with their own criticisms of the fascist movement. Unaware of the ideological developments of Sergio Panunzio, Enrico Corradini, or many of the other like-minded theoreticians on the Italian peninsula, Marxists tasked themselves with interpreting fascism through an orthodox lens. The development of history, in Marx's vision, took on a progressive development in response to the changing forces of production. Marx states in his Communist Manifesto that it's the task of the Marxists to support not necessarily the vision of a communist society, but to promote the development of said forces of production and the social relations between economic groups, in effort to reach a communist world as soon as possible. In the 1840s, this entailed allying with the Social Democrats against the Conservatives in France, the Radicals in Switzerland, the bourgeoisie in Germany, not losing sight of their greater goal, and reminding the working classes of all nations the direction they must head in next. Those who sought the development of the social relations and forces of production were regarded to be progressive, and those who opposed such development, in favour of conservatism or to return backwards, were deemed reactionary. Fascism, upon a simple first glance, appears to be wholly reactionary, if not the absolute manifestation of reaction. Fascism's staunch opposition to international socialism in Italy and its promotion of national identity, distracting the masses from their class identity, squarely put it in the reactionary sphere for most Marxist intellectuals in Europe, keenly ignoring that many of the intellectuals of fascism were in fact from the syndicalist and socialist left. Mussolini and Alfredo Rocco, prior to their defections, were powerful socialists in the intellectual and political sphere, with Mussolini himself even being a leader of the Italian Socialist Party. In the early years of fascist interpretations, it was clear what the consensus therefore was. Julius Braunfall, in his article Der Putsch der Faschisten, and Julius Deutsch in Die Faschisten Gefahr, were quick to identify fascism as the brutal expression of a property-owning class's desire for domination, sowing terror and false conscience among dissidents, as the tool of profit-mad capitalist reaction, taking advantage of the dark mysticism so appealing to Latin psychology. The Fourth World Congress of Lenin's Third International, held immediately after Mussolini's ascension to power, correspondingly declared fascism to be an instrument of counter-revolutionary reaction, consciously employed against the working masses by the agrarian capitalists of the Po Valley. Because the bourgeois class is relatively inclusive, containing all individuals who owned the or a part of a means of production, the precedent of fascism being reactionary and anti-revolutionary soon transitioned into identifying exactly what part of the bourgeoisie were the originators of fascism. Hungarian Marxist Gyula Szász, under the pseudonym Giulio Aquila, published Fascismus in Italien, first associating fascism with the industrial bourgeoisie, knowing that the fanaticized petty bourgeoisie in Italy could hardly qualify as its financiers. Despite a lack of empirical evidence on part of the Marxists in this time for all their theories, it concerned them not of the possibility that fascism might be an ideology that existed outside of the traditional historical dialectics, and therefore threatened the historical materialism pushed by Marxists up to this point. It was clear to the Marxist rationale that whether they could find evidence of fascism's reactionary capitalist leanings or not, that it was an impossibility for fascism to exist outside of their interpretations. The official interpretation by the Italian Communist Party in 1926 mirrored the interpretations of Aquila and the disciples of his interpretations, such as Clara Zetkin in Der Kampf gegen den Faschismus, however changed the originator of fascism to an industrial and agrarian oligarchy. By 1928, the Communist International had declared fascism to be the terroristic dictatorship of big capital. Palmiro Togliatti in the same year, in A Proposito del Fascismo, argued that fascism served the interests of the entire bourgeoisie, la grossa borghesia, The two most important and comprehensive works in the interwar interpretations of fascism were soon published by Daniel Guerin and Rajani Palmdurt. It can be argued that the climax of this phase of Marxist interpretations, an irrational and fanatically hateful phase, were embodied in these two authors. These works sought to establish what big capital, seeing the supposed decline in the rate of profit in the post-war era foretold by the communists, saw in fascism that made it such an appealing movement for their salvation. For Guerin, in Fascism and Big Business, he once again identified fascism with industrial capital and claimed that it was in its final throes of senescence. Guerin hypothesized that the captains in heavy industry, wedded to the magnates of high finance, with a stake in heavy industry, sought in fascism the ability to salvage the survival of the bourgeoisie in increasingly difficult years. When capitalism is in its end times, they gamble on the brutality of fascism. This was then expanded by Palmdurt in Fascism and Social Revolution, where upon tasked with salvaging big capital, fascism employed measures of systematically restricting output, curtailing technological innovation, and stabilizing production at a level of simple reproduction. In effect, fascism's role was to return society to an artificially pre-industrial barbarism, whereupon capital could continue to reign. With this theory came many issues. Early 20th century Italy had a bourgeoisie nowhere near as mature as what was demanded for this theory to take place. Italy's economy, as has been previously established, was severely underdeveloped, and the whole role of fascism in the Italian nationalist sphere was to bring about economic growth in effort to stand up to far more advanced industrial nations. As well as this, there was no evidence of any kind of economic decline either in fascism throughout its reign, nor in the capitalist nations that could be attributed to a declining rate of profit so key to Marxist theory. In fact, fascist Italy only saw economic growth in line with its true function between 1922 and 1937. If fascism was to be properly assimilated into the Marxist worldview by the Third International, then it couldn't be regarded as a force of capitalist reaction, as it had not merited such criticism. In realizing the inadequacies of the communist interpretation of fascism, similarities had begun to be drawn between fascist Italy and the Soviet Union itself. As early as the 1930s, Leon Trotsky began pointing out similarities in The Revolution Betrayed. Years later, Bruno Rizzi stated, "What fascism consciously sought, the Soviet Union involuntarily constructed." They were both party dictatorships which found their authority in the wake of revolutions in backward economies, making them materially prone to having similar developments, with both seeing the need for industrialization to compete with Western powers, with the Soviet Union even using nationalism to sow unity and solidarity among its population. Unfortunately, in the wake of the Second World War, what little accurate insight was made about fascism was thrown out as the conflict between fascist, communist and capitalist powers mythologized it as the antithesis of all things moral, and decades were to pass before any meaningful development to Marxist theories of fascism would return. In the 1970s, after 25 years of post-war observation, it was finally clear to intellectuals that capitalism had not lapsed into its final stage, the fascist stage of development, but had in actuality prospered, with the standard interpretation of fascism in the Brief Philosophical Dictionary as the open terroristic dictatorship of capital, a definition premised on predictions which had not come true at the time or since then. It was necessary for intellectuals to revise their interpretations of fascism in communist circles. Alexander Galkin first began to revise some of the central ideas behind fascism in 1970, with Capitalist Society and Fascism, revising ideas such as that it marked the end stage of capitalism, and that there were only two logical ends to capitalist society, a sinking into fascism and a rise to proletarian democracy. Galkin noted that fascism, whilst exemplifying all the attributes of a state system whereupon capitalism could ascend to a higher production level, was a risky solution for the bourgeoisie, and therefore a rare result of its rule. Galkin noted that Mussolini's fascism had arisen to an autonomous movement in the circumstances of special crises, and that only subsequently had the ruling circles of the peninsula recognized that it might serve their particular interests. The fact that Mussolini's fascism had an independent origin and pursued an independent course clearly posed problems, in Galkin's judgment, for the capitalist ruling class. Whilst Italian fascism did satisfy some of the basic interests of the ruling class and its upper crust as a whole, it nonetheless inevitably entailed infringement of the concrete interests of its separate representatives and entire factions. Italian fascism was being recognised by Soviet intellectuals that have independence from the ruling class thought to have been its puppet masters. This realisation proved that ownership of the property of a state does not necessarily mean dominance over its political structures, as very little evidence of this could be seen within Mussolini's Italy, a fact replicated in the previous decade by Paolo Alatri, wherein being a Marxist-Leninist from Italy provided testament to the fact that Mussolini was, quote, the absolute master of Italy. A year later, Mihaly Vajda published a chapter of his new book discussing fascism. Vajda equally saw faults and flaws in the understanding of fascism in the 20s and 30s and sought to revise the Soviet interpretation of fascism's relationship with the bourgeoisie. Vajda saw that fascism's role was to address specific developmental problems of industrial capitalism under particular national conditions. It required and advocated an ideology of national solidarity and unity to organize human and material resources to the service of mass economic and technological development. Consequently, the bourgeois notions of individuality, liberty and equality were all dropped in service of a utilitarian collective good. Rather than fascism being the tool of a late-stage capitalist bourgeoisie, it was its own tool in an economically retrograde environment, pushing for the development of the forces of production. It was a political response to objective historical and economic conditions. From this new angle discovered by Soviet intellectuals in the 1970s, the case could be made that fascism was in fact far more progressive than it was reactionary, an idea that shook the traditional understanding of Marxist historical development, but was nevertheless taken aboard with no alternative explanation. In the 1960s, it had become evident that there were difficulties between the two main communist states of the Soviet Union and China, with the intellectuals of the October Revolution and the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution both employing the term fascism in their critiques of the other's system. As the understanding of fascism was developed in the 70s, the new ideas central to their respective interpretations of the ideology were employed against the other. It was in fact this climate of tension between the Chinese and the Russians that prompted prior mentioned intellectuals such as Kolkin and Vajda to find an interpretation of fascism that could account for the post-war events that shattered the intellectual pretensions of Marxism as a social science theory. The Sino-Soviet dispute then led on to further new interpretations of Mussolini's regime that allowed for identifying failed socialist systems as fascistic in nature. Maoists of the 1970s identified a class of bureaucrats in the Soviet Union who sought to re-establish capitalism with their new class conscience-based branch of Marxism, exemplified by the likes of Nicholas Poulantas. Since the Marxist interpretation of fascism was still clinging on to old reactionary ideas, it was therefore easy for the Chinese Communist Party to identify the bourgeois conscience found in many Russian elites as fascistic in nature, rendering the Soviet Union a fascist state. On the other hand, Russian intellectuals were keen in the 60s to identify China as itself fascistic, pointing out the nationalistic personality cult surrounding Mao that exploited the basest instincts of humankind. The Soviet Union, seeing that the Maoist definition of proletariat and bourgeoisie were no longer connected to the forces of production, but adherents to Mao Zedong thought, were eager to liken it to those fascist dictatorships which based morality on adherence to their own regimes. What the Sino-Soviet dispute highlighted, more fundamentally than the internal strife between Marxist sects, was that the two states embodied degrees of fascism not previously considered by either. Despite both states warping fascism to their own use against the other in the intellectual sphere, it at least, in such conditions, prompted Marxists to consider fascism as an independent political force rather than a superstructure upon a mechanical base. At a similar time to these events, leading onwards to the fall of the Soviet Union, was a period of Russian history where it seemed that the Soviets began to embrace its more fascistic elements. In the mid-1960s, the divide between Russian nationalism and so-called Soviet patriotism had worn incredibly thin. Soviet intellectuals were caught in the problem of conflating the Soviet Union and Russia in terms such as motherland, and began making increasing references to the spirit of the nation and national traditions, much according to the ideas theorized by fascist theoreticians decades before, that Soviet patriotism was indeed a cover for Russian nationalism and its wholly political interests. This nationalism inspired student groups to then campaign for the collection of Russian artistic and cultural heritage, particularly pre-Soviet products of the old imperial age. Groups such as the All-Russian Social Christian Union also began to advocate for an interventionist, nationalist state in this time, and by 1968 Bolshevism was even being written off as a passing state in the development of Russian history by Viktor Chalmayev in his article titled Inevitability. As well as a rediscovered nationalism built from the ground up in Russia, there was a profound reaction against the liberal and humanitarian approaches to socialism increasingly being accepted by the likes of Khrushchev and Gorbachev. Communists such as Sergei Kurginian envisioned a white communism which was authoritarian, national socialistic, and spiritually over materially enriching, and amassed a large amount of support from Gorbachev's opposition and in the highest circles of Soviet power. And near the end of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who foresaw the crisis of a post-Soviet Russia and proposed an authoritarian, anti-liberal nationalism to deter it, polled at 22% in the 1993 election. It was clear then that whilst the Soviet Union crushed the fascist states in Italy and Germany, they had succumbed to the final victory of fascism over the once starkly opposed socialist state in the time of a revolution. Fascism had proved its applicability among the nations of its advocates and eventually its staunch opponents, and won the political battle against Marxism. And whilst we don't recognise it today, established itself as the primary opposition to Western civilization, not as a passing early explosion over 20 years, but as a tense standoff against liberalism and capitalism from the beginning of the century to the very end. Whilst Marxism presents its own outcome of a society premised on its own economic and philosophical laws, upon application in a real-world environment, it's evident that it transitions very suddenly into a more fascistic state. As the 20th century progressed, the Soviet Union abandoned the class warfare of Trotsky and Lenin in effort to match itself up to its liberal, individualist, capitalist, in other words, plutocratic Western states, which used their developed economies to exploit lesser developed ones. To compete against this, the Stalinist era employed mass industrialization to catch up economically to the West. Dissidents were crushed to ensure an efficient transition from the aristocratic serfdom that was Imperial Russia to an industrial proletarian state. Stages of the Soviet understanding of fascism therefore followed an aggressive critical stage following the interwar years, a neutralization stage where fascist ideas were more accurately observed and found to be on par with many of Russia's actions, and an inevitable stage of embrace where in the fall of the Soviet Union the mask was thrown off in an attempt to salvage a white communism where fascism was adapted for the crisis that faced Russia in that particular moment. Had the Marxists of the 20s and 30s been aware of the true origins of fascism, from the rise of the Italian economic nationalists to the merging of nationalism and syndicalism and its eventual actualization come the March on Rome, many of the doctrinal faults of the Soviet Union could have been addressed by recognizing the merits of Mussolini's movement in the development of another alike underdeveloped nation-state.